After the Civil War, the United States remained very secluded from the world as it dealt with the ordeal of Southern Reconstruction and Western expansion. But once the Wild West was tamed and the South back in the Union, the United States cast its eyes to the world at large. The American people were ready for expansion into new markets, countries, and cultures. It became irresistible when the newspaper men like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst would write about foreign expeditions as manly as it could get. This was reinforced with books written by missionaries such as Josiah Strong with Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis. It was right up the alley of aggressive, masculine men like Theodore Roosevelt. Oh, no. Okay, hey, there he is. Little mistake every once in a while. Americans like TR were reading about how Britain, Japan, Russia, Germany, and other nations were expanding into Africa, South America, and China. America wanted their piece of the world too. The United States had the spirit for world expansion, but not the resources to be able to do so. One resource the US lacked was a navy strong enough to defend against European forces, and guess who had the greatest navy at this time? Nonetheless, Americans were ravenous, even if that meant taking on the old lion. But this was not just Britain that the United States had to contend with. During this time, the world was on edge, with nations at each other's throats, saber-rattling at any slight. America and Germany nearly went to war over the Samoan Islands. Italy nearly came to war with America when 11 Italians were lynched in New Orleans. And America almost went to war with Chile over the deaths of 2 American sailors. The United States was not in a real position to fight, but would use diplomacy to spread the wings of the eagle. Secretary of State James B. Blaine created the Big Sister policy to attract Latin nations and to support the United States' hemispheric aspirations. This would lead to the first Pan-American Conference in 1889 held in Washington, D.C., thus beginning important diplomatic ties to Latin nations. Along with the advancements of politics, the development of steel naval vessels, and the influence of Captain Alfred Manton on the control of the sea, poised Americans to be ready to fight, and we nearly had a real bad one. In South America, a conflict was about to boil over. In 1894, British-controlled Guyana and Venezuela had a border dispute over land that was claimed by Venezuelan General Domingo Antonio Cifuentes. Cifuentes was held a hero among the Venezuelans, but a trespasser in the eyes of the old lion. The anger of Britain would only increase when it was discovered that the disputed land had vast amounts of gold. Britain was readying for war. Venezuela would appeal to the United States, invoking the Monroe Doctrine. President Grover Cleveland and his Secretary of State, Richard Olney, were all too eager to reply. Olney would go to tell the British that the United States owned and controlled all of the Western Hemisphere and would do well to back off. Britain, again, the number 1 navy in the world at this time, would totally disregard Olney and chalk it up as twisting the tail of the lion. This would cause President Cleveland to send a special message to Congress to appropriate for a commission of experts to draw a line of the Monroe Doctrine, and if Britain violated that line, then the United States would fight. Outrage and fear would grip the American public at the thought of going to war with Britain, but the United States was saved by other geopolitical events. Germany, under the leadership of Kaiser Wilhelm, was on the move in Europe, and Dutch-descended Boers were on the warpath in South Africa. Britain did not want to have to fight in both the Old World and the New World, and agreed to arbitration. It was not until both the Americans and the British calmed down did they realize that they were both sides of the same coin, sharing much of the same goals: opening trade, spreading Anglo-Saxon culture, Christianity, and their view of civilized life. This would bring together the United States and Britain into a lasting special friendship extending to today. This was known as the Great Rapprochement. With the British threat gone, the US turned to the Pacific and cast its own expansionist eyes on Hawaii. The island served as a way station for American trader vessels, and in 1820, missionaries arrived, giving Americans a foothold on the island. The US laid claims on Hawaii as early as 1840, and in 1877 made a treaty with the native government granting the US the prize of Pearl Harbor. Hawaii would also prove to be fertile ground for plantation of sugar, but as Americans came to the islands, old world diseases would kill over 5/6 of the native population. The sugar industry would also attract foreign workers from Japan and China. Soon there were more Chinese and Japanese immigrants than white Americans and Hawaiian natives. In 1890, the market for sugar fell out and Congress passed the McKinley Tariff that prohibited the trade of Hawaiian sugar. American plantation owners would immediately appeal to the United States government for annexation, but was blocked by Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani, who was vehemently opposed to U.S. control of the islands. Desperate white Americans, with the aid of American troops, would stage a revolt against Liliuokalani. A treaty was quickly and forcefully made and sent to Washington, D.C., and passed through the Senate. When President Harrison left office, President Grover Cleveland would win his second term and inherit the Hawaiian Treaty. Cleveland did not approve of the way that the treaty was presented and found that the majority of Hawaiians did not want to be a part of the United States. So Cleveland withdrew from the treaty but was unable to reinstate Liliuokalani back into power. It was only a matter of time for the Hawaiians. Hawaii would be annexed in 1898. Now, in 1894, Cuba was on the path to rebellion. Cubans would be moved to revolt against their Spanish rulers because of the Spanish mistreatment of the Cuban people. This intensified when the McKinley Tariff crippled sugar production and exports. The insurrectos would implement a scorched earth strategy, burning sugarcane fields, sugar mills, and passenger trains. Their plight could no longer be ignored. Americans took notice and had sympathy for the Cuban people, but also had great concern for the $50 million investment stake at risk, along with about $100 million in trade each year. Opportunists, Senator Henry Lodge observed that control over Cuba would give control over the Gulf of Mexico and lobbied for intervention. He did not have to try very hard to convince people to intervene. Spanish general known as the Butcher Wellner would round up many civilians, most not involved in the rebellion, and place them in reconcentration camps. Behind the barbed wire walls, people would starve to death or die from disease, from mistreatment. This was red meat for the sensationalist newspapermen of America. William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer took very little time to spread the word of Spanish atrocities, both real and not real. Hearst would send out artist Frederick Remington to, quote, furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. Together they would rally Americans against the savage Spanish. What happened next sent Americans over the edge. In 1898, the USS Maine was dispatched to Cuba to provide protection and escape for Americans if the need would arise. Unfortunately, it would be the men of the Maine that would need escape. On February 15, 1898, Havana Harbor was rocked within an explosion. When the dust had settled, the Maine was sinking into the deep, bringing with her 260 sailors to their death. The United States wanted answers. U.S. and Spanish officials launched an investigation to the cause of the explosion. Spanish officials concluded that the explosion was internal and most likely just a terrible accident. The American officers found a much different result. American officers claimed that it was a Spanish mine that had sucked the Maine and all of her sons with her. Upon the publication of the findings, Americans were mad for revenge and fully supporting war against the Spanish menace. It would not be until 1976 that the U.S. Navy would admit that the Spanish investigation was correct. It was an internal explosion. Yellow journalism headlines echoed the battle cry of Americans, "Remember the Maine." Buried under all of the sensationalism was that Spain had agreed to end reconcentration camps and have an armistice with the rebels, but the American public would not hear of it. President McKinley was caught in the middle of hard decisions. He did not want to go to war with Spain, but nor did he want Spain to continue to have control over Cuba. Americans, including tough guy Teddy Roosevelt, smelled fear on McKinley and soon lost faith in his leadership. Navy Assistant Secretary Teddy Roosevelt was chomping at the bit for war to start. Just a mere 10 days after the Maine explosion, Roosevelt, while the Navy Secretary was away, would send orders to Commodore George Dewey to attack the Spanish fortress in the Philippines. Dewey would arrive in Manila and open fire on the Spanish fleet, sinking every ship and send over 400 Spaniards to their deaths. Dewey did not have the forces to raid the fortress and had to wait for reinforcements. McKinley would eventually give in to the war-hungry public. On April 11, 1989, McKinley would send his war message to Congress. Congress almost tripped over themselves approving the call for war. Furthermore, Congress would pass the Teller Amendment, announcing to the world that the United States would whoop Spain and grant the Cubans their freedom. The American people reacted with jubilation at the announcement of war with Spain. TR would join the Spanish-American War with his own fighting force known as the Rough Riders. The Americans had the upper hand in terms of grand strategy. The Spanish Navy had squeezed themselves into the Santiago harbor where they could be easily blockaded by the U.S. Navy. The plan was for the American troops to squeeze out the Spanish forces into the ships and then sink them at sea. Unfortunately, the American troops were not ready for the hot, humid weather of Cuba. American troops were under the command of very large General William Shafter, who was so big that while he was fighting gout, he had troops carrying him around on a door. But the troops were unprepared for the weather of Cuba. They came in wool uniforms designed for sub-zero temperatures. Many troops, when they arrived to Cuba, would shed off every bit of clothing and go ashore naked and prepare for camp. In June of 1898, the American troops worked their way across the Cuban island with the help of Cuban rebels. On July 1st, Americans would take El Canal and Kettle Hill, where TR would have the time of his life, killing Spanish forces. The American army would close in on Santiago, quickly leading to a very one-sided naval battle, resulting with Spain signing an armistice on August 12, 1898. The United States had easily won the war and came with the spoils of war. The United States gained Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines after paying Spain $20 million. Uncle Sam had grown the American family far beyond the continental United States. This sparked an immediate debate in the United States of expansionism versus anti-colonialism. Soon after the annexation of the Philippines, the Anti-Imperialist League came into action against McKinley. The League had 5 main points. First, that annexation was a dishonor and would destroy Americans' commitments of self-determination. Second, that annexation violated the consent of the governed, throwing back to John Locke. Third, despotism overseas may slowly breed despotism at home. Fourth, imperialism would be extremely costly and not turn a profit. And finally, that annexation would place the United States at risk of military conflict across the globe. Annexation posed a constitutional issue. Did the Constitution follow the conquest of the Stars and Stripes? Were the inhabitants of Puerto Rico or the Philippines American citizens? Did the rights of the U.S. Constitution apply to them? To answer this question, the Supreme Court of the United States and the Insular cases found that the flag stood separate from the U.S. Constitution, that Puerto Rico and the Philippines were subject to American law, but did not enjoy the civil liberties thereof. another problem on the plate of Uncle Sam was Cuba. The U.S. promised with the Teller Amendment that Cuba would be free. So in 1902, the U.S. withdrew from Cuba? Well, not completely. In 1901, prior to the departure, the U.S. made Cuba add the Platt Amendment to their constitution that stated Cuba could not enter treaties that may harm Cuba's independence and could not take on debt beyond their resources, and that American troops could intervene when they saw fit. The war proved that the U.S. was a world power, gave the U.S. world respect, and created a new American spirit domestically, created a large navy, and closed the gap between the North and the South. Now for the bad. The Philippines wanted their freedom like the Cubans and were not given freedom. The United States would leave the Philippines out of the peace negotiations with Spain, and this would cause an insurrection against the American troops. Employing guerrilla tactics, the Filipinos would harass American troops. This would result in terrible treatment of Filipinos who were suspected of being part of the uprising. The United States would place them in camps that were just as bad as the Spanish camps, and they would implement the water cure, forcing water down the throats of captured Filipinos until they confessed or died. There was bloodshed on both sides and great human suffering. Eventually, the Americans would overcome the insurrection when they captured Emilio Aguinaldo, leader of the guerrilla fighters. The Philippines would get their independence on July 4th, 1946. William McKinley had seen it all play out. The Spanish-American War, the annexation of Hawaii, insurrection of the Philippines, and came out on top. It is because of his leadership that he won his re-election in 1900. It also helped that he selected an exceptionally popular figure as his vice president, one T.R. McKinley would only get to serve 6 months of his second term because he would be murdered by a crazed anarchist in New York. Thus, the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt begins. T.R. was a truly unique individual. Born into an affluent family, he grew up to be well educated and would graduate from Harvard with Phi Beta Kappa honors. T.R. prided himself in education by constantly reading on his free time and emphasized the importance of physical strength. T.R.'s presidency would directly reflect his own personality, big, bold, and adventurous. T.R.'s personality was opposite of his predecessor. What T.R. wanted, T.R. got. Roosevelt would look south and wince at the journey that American vessels had to take in order to trade with the other side of the country. This is where the idea of a canal to be built started. Roosevelt and experts started to look for areas to dig a canal to shorten the trip, but they hit a snag. It had nothing to do with the cost of the canal or the geographical location. It was a legal matter. The United States was still in agreement with Britain that no one would have single control over the Isthmian route. Britain would eventually release the United States of the treaty because they were still dealing with troubles in Europe and the Boers War in South Africa. Britain did not want to have a conflict with Roosevelt. He made himself quite clear when he said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." The British knew that Roosevelt would use the stick. Congress in 1902 decided to build a canal in Panama and offered Colombia, who controlled Panama at the time, $10 million in annual payments of $250,000. Colombia said no, to which TR did not take well. A rebellion was incited with the help of the U.S. Navy against Colombia. 3 days after the rebellion, Roosevelt would recognize Panama, and mere 15 days later, a treaty was signed in Washington establishing the Panama Canal Zone. The rebels were counting on the building of the canal to bring economic prosperity, and that Roosevelt would use the big stick to keep Colombia at bay. Roosevelt would take the reins of power with the Monroe Doctrine to the fullest extent that he could. This was the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He believed in preventative intervention and would send Marines to Latin American nations and take over debt for Latin nations to prevent any sort of interference with European powers. Roosevelt not only filled the shoes of McKinley, he busted them open. he would walk to the world stage and attempt to tap down potential escalation, only to make things worse. Russia had been on the move southward towards China to use the warm water ports of Manchuria, but Japan saw this as a threat and attacked. The Russian fleet was decimated. The resulting war would drag on until Japan was running out of money and manpower. Japan asked Roosevelt to negotiate a treaty. Roosevelt was happy to oblige, but secretly favored the Russians because they could serve as a counterbalance to a growing Japan. The settlement brought by Roosevelt left both sides disappointed and placed a bitter taste in the mouth of the Japanese, who saw that they won the war. Japan walked away with the annexation of Korea and the Russians leaving the Sakhalin Islands. Roosevelt would be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for his role. This was not the end of Japanese anger. As a result of the Russo-Japanese War, taxes in Japan became very high, causing a wave of Japanese immigrants to California. So much, in fact, that 3% of California was Japanese. Although a small percent, it was seen as a threat to the American way of life, and the San Francisco Board of Education would segregate Japanese and Korean students away from white American children. Japanese resentment of this treatment grew in California and in Japan. Roosevelt did not like the idea of war with Japan because of some education board in California, so he would invite the board to dinner at the White House, where he not only showed his huge smile, but also the stick. The so-called gentleman's agreement was made that the board would stop the segregation and Japan would halt the immigration of Japanese workers by taking their passports. Roosevelt did not want this agreement to appear to be out of fear of war, so Roosevelt commanded the entire Navy fleet to go on a world tour and show everyone the might of the United States. This would be the Great White Fleet, where it did dock in Japan, met by children in kimonos waving American flags. The U.S. and Japan signed the Ru-Takehara Agreement, stating that both powers would respect each other's territorial possessions in the Pacific, and it also outlined that each nation would hold the open door policy for China. Well, students, that's the end of the lesson. Next time we will go over Chapter 28 on progressivism and the Roosevelt years. Please make sure that you are following the CDC recommendations. Wash your hands, don't touch your face, and stay inside at all means.